Right, just making sure. I think I'm there. I can't see a video of myself. I'm screen sharing. Stop. Right. Okay, let's lift this video up so you can see me. Hello, everybody. This is our second webinar. This is on lifting your emotional intelligence, where I've effectively mashed down my my stand beginning to a workshop down to about 40 minutes. And as I said, welcome to the webinar. For those of you living in Sydney, hope you've enjoyed the weather. We've had 4 days, 3 of now torrential rain, and it's continuing. Anyway, I'll load up the screen share and load up the webinar, and just start screen share. Here we go. And there's our little presentation, Secret to Lifting Your Emotional Intelligence, and welcome aboard. Right, the agenda today is very simple. I'm going to define emotional intelligence, then give you a brief introduction to the Hum-Wadsworth technology, then look at other profiling techniques, in particular neuro-linguistic programming, DISC and Myers-Briggs, and then have a bit of a discussion about the big 5, psychopaths, and discuss a case study why recognizing psychopaths is important, namely Arthur Anderson, and then finish up with a quick summary. Right, what is EQ? To start off with, when we talk about emotional intelligence, the first thing to talk about is intelligence, i.e. what is IQ? And IQ, or the testing of intelligence, really got started in World War I. A Frenchman called Alfred Binet was looking at testing school children and came up with a famous formula, which is your mental age divided by your chronological age as a measure of intelligence. And he developed a series of tests to try to work out what your mental age was, how intelligent you were. And the US Army picked up on this work and developed what was known as the alpha-beta test. They had a very, very big reason for doing this, is because they wanted to make sure that people were at the time crashing airplanes and they were dying. But they weren't worried about that, but they were worried about the airplanes. They were incredibly expensive. So they turned around and said to the psychologist, could you please design us a test so we could have people who could learn to fly more quickly and also be intelligent enough to fly the plane. And that sort of work progressed on. They didn't do a bad job, proved it. Then in 1995 was the next big breakthrough. A gentleman called Wenchler developed what was called the Adult Intelligence Skill, or the YS, which is the test which is probably most often used when you actually get your IQ tested. And he came up with the measurement of IQ being your average IQ, the mean IQ of the population being 100, and setting a standard deviation of 15. So 67% of the population fall in an IQ range 85 to 115. What then happened was, as people were developing intelligence tested, they noticed there were multiple intelligences. There was general intelligence, which is denoted by the little letter G, but then they noticed that some people had a higher verbal intelligence and some people had a higher numerical intelligence. And the fact that you could have, in fact, a high general, a high verbal, and a low numerical, or lower numerical, or in a different order. So this work on multiple intelligence continued on, and the next thing that people did was talk about other intelligences. And was that work that was done by a gentleman called Gardner. He was professor of education, I think it was at Yale. And he came up with the fact that we have multiple intelligences. And there's a list of them here. You can see several of them, like the verbal and the linguistic and mathematical had already been recognized, but he said there was musical intelligence, spatial intelligence, kinesthetic, interpersonal, naturalistic. That was the 8 that he listed off, and then other people added a thing called existential intelligence, or a spiritual intelligence. There's 2 things about this. First of all, there is actually no empirical evidence whether these multiple multiple intelligence actually exist. And secondly, people who have a high musical talent, the good ones are actually intelligent as well. There's a high correlation with G. So that's actually caused the thing to be sort of, okay, presenting everyone. Hopefully this is working. Anyway, the next thing is to continue on and look at the next sort of test. And what happened with multiple intelligence was that the Salovey and Mayer in 1990, using Gardner's idea, came up with the idea that there was an emotional intelligence. And they defined it as the ability to perceive, control, and evaluate emotions. And they said emotional intelligence was like intelligence in that you could measure it. Now, there's still some debate about this, and I must confess, I find emotional intelligence tests always slightly sus because there's a high degree of self-reporting. However, and there's a question whether is there an inborn talent. I believe some people are genetically disposed to having a greater sensitivity to their emotions and also looking at the emotions of other people. However, I firmly believe it is a learned skill and you can improve it. And that's, as I said, a debate which is continuing, but it's the learned skill important part of emotional intelligence. What subsequently happened is Goleman effectively published Emotional Intelligence in 1996. This was the breakthrough book. The book sold 5 million copies in its 5 years, and in fact added emotional intelligence to the management lexicon. And the great breakthrough that Goleman came up with is he said emotional intelligence could be defined in terms of 4 steps: self-awareness of emotions, self-management of those emotions, social awareness, or what he called empathy, and then the social skills or relationship management. So there were these 4 steps. When he first defined it, he also had a 5th variant there called motivation, but that's basically dropped out. Mainly when people talk about emotional intelligence now, they use these 4 steps of Goleman. Now, what's interesting, if you actually read the book, and it's a good book, he writes well, Goleman, but he says at the end, does he have a model of core emotions? I mean, are there basic emotions common to everyone? And he actually says he thinks there is, but he actually he doesn't come up with, and he relates to a chap called Ekman, who will come up with in a few moments. He says maybe he's got a model. And what is actually interesting about emotions is that the first big book on emotions was actually written by Charles Darwin in 1872, in a book called The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals. Has nothing, of course, widespread currency as basically the origin of species. It's a very fascinating book. I haven't read it, but I did check out Wikipedia, and it was one of the first books actually to use illustrations. So what's absolutely wonderful about it is that the authors and the publishers were complaining bitterly about the cost of the book. Anyway, what was wonderful about Darwin, in his usual systematic way, he was a wonderful observer, of course, of both animals and humans, was he broke classified emotions into low spirits, anxiety and grief, high spirits, joy and love, and ill-tempered sulkiness, hatred and anger, disdain and contempt, surprise, astonishment, and then self-attention. As you can see, there's quite a range of emotions there. And the next big breakthrough, I could say, if there was emotions, was in fact by a gentleman called Paul Ekman, who Goleman actually referred to. And Goleman actually said there were 7 core emotions. And his model was used as the basis of a very good film called Inside Out. And his 7 emotions are effectively the 5 he used Inside Out: disgust, fear, joy, sadness, and anger. And then he also talks about contempt and surprise. So it's so Goleman used 7 core emotions, and he's done a lot of work on relating to them to not only facial expressions, but also micro expressions, which are these very quick changes in the face. Anyway, Ekman defined 7 core emotions, and fair enough, that's there. My problem with the 7 core emotions is that when you talk about them, they're transient. And I'll go into more detail in a few moments. However, if we use as a definition of emotional intelligence, what I will use is this wonderful 2x2 chart. Being an MBA, of course, our favorite thing is that, in fact, you have two things you can do. You can understand or you can influence, and you can talk about yourself or you can talk about others. So self-understanding, one of the easiest ways to get some self-understanding of your core emotional drives is to do a personality test. To develop self-control, you basically can do mindfulness courses or recognize what they are. For understanding others, well, empathy is generally the phrase everyone uses. And then influencing, of course, you use social skills. But I like this as a simple 2x2 matrix. It's very easy and very quickly to do the definition. The next thing is to refer to Goleman's book, where he was very good is showing how emotional intelligence was important. And what he did is he used a very famous study, which is called the marshmallow study. And you can see it executed here in front of a young girl. Effectively, the test is they put a marshmallow on a plate and say to the young girl or boy, we're going to leave you alone for 10 minutes. If when we come back, the marshmallow is still there, we'll give you another one. And you can eat two rather than just one. So the question is, can the child delay self-gratification? And the person who carried out this study was a gentleman called Walter Mischel. He had two daughters. They were going to the Bing Nursery School at Stanford. He ended up giving 653 children the marshmallow test. And what he discovered was about 10% could hold back. And he published that as a finding. What he then found out as when he was talking to his two daughters as they grew up, what he noticed was that the names of the people in the 10% cohort, their names started coming up more and more frequently. They were the ones who were elected to the school council. They were the ones who got to university. They were the ones who did well in the exams. And they went back and did a survey and basically noted out that those 10% were significantly more successful later in life. There's a very, very good article in the New Yorker about Mischel and his work in 18 May 2009. It's called Don't, The Secret of Self-Control. And what Goleman says in his book, and I totally agree with him, is that being able to delay self-gratification is a true measure of emotional intelligence, i.e. you're controlling, in that stage, your emotional intelligence. My difference is to normal people is most people, if you talk about emotional intelligence, will say people drive performance and emotions drive people. My argument is, yes, this is true, but it doesn't go far enough. It's that temperament drives emotions. Now, if you look at people, luck and memory are very important. However, King's College London, they did a study of over 11,000 identical twins. And what they're trying to work out was why were these children successful in exams? And their conclusions were that 58% of exam success is due to genes and 29% was due to the teachers and schools. Not a finding the teachers and schools were exactly happy with, but that's the reality. And effectively what they're saying is, what the study said is, nature is two times as important or twice as important as nurture. And that brings us down to temperament. Temperament is your genetic emotional bias, how you react genetically. And so that's my key argument. Now, so what I say is emotional intelligence is achieving self and social mastery by being smart with core emotions, i.e. self-mastery is awareness plus management, social mastery is empathy plus social skills. And it's temperament, which is more important than your transient emotions. So if we're going to discuss temperament, what we then have to discuss is, of course, models of temperament. And this now turns around to a defining moment in my life, which is a gentleman called Charles Handy. I did my MBA at the London Business School, 71 to 73. And I was very fortunate. There was a recession on, but I was flown twice to New York by McKinsey's for interviews. And Charles Handy was my tutor, and I was meeting him every couple of weeks, once a fortnight. And Charles said to me, And Chris, 73, is quite a recession on. Have you managed to get a job yet? And I sort of brushed my lapel and said, Charles, I've got the big one. McKinsey's in New York. And then he said an amazing statement to me. He said, Chris, I'm not sure I'd take the job with you. And what he ended up saying was that the key to business success, he'd come to a conclusion, was how you could handle yourself in a one-on-one meeting. That's when you get the sale, hire someone, fire someone, get hired yourself, get fired yourself, raise the finance. How you can handle yourself in a one-on-one meeting is, he thought, was critical to being successful in business. And then he said, MBAs don't teach you that. And if you want to be good at one-on-one meetings, good training is to become a salesperson. So what Charles said to me was, don't take the job with McKinsey. If you can afford it, go learn how to sell. Anyway, I ended up taking his advice. And what happened to me is I came out to Australia and maneuvered my way into a sales position with a company called International Computers Limited. And 6 months in, I went on a course, and I learned a thing called the Hum-Wadsworth, which is a model of temperament. And the model is very simple. In 1920, a psychologist called Rosenoff was trying to work out exactly this question. What drives us, our core emotions? What makes us genetically different emotionally? And he came up with two very interesting hypotheses. The first one is we're all slightly mad, which was a big breakthrough because at that time you were defined as either being sane or insane. And Rosenoff said, no, that's not it. We're not mad, sane or insane. We're all slightly mad. We've got different shades of gray. And then he said, which was the next breakthrough, was compared to the number of physical things that could go wrong with us, there were in fact only 4 mental illnesses. And what he said is there were 4 of them. They were on a spectrum, and we were each positioned in a different position on each of these 4 spectrum. And he also said there was a 5th component called the normal, which sort of controls basically or acts as a balancing factor to the other 4. And the theory was put out, and what happened was in the 1930s, a new statistical technique was being developed called factor analysis. And Hum and Wadsworth, Hum was a statistician, Wadsworth was a psychologist, they developed one of the first decent personality tests. And what they came back is they said, look, Rosenoff was on the right track, but there weren't 5 components in the personality. There were, in fact, 7. And the Hum-Wadsworth swept everything before it. It became, in fact, you can actually read an article. If you go to my website, you'll see a emotionalintelligencecourse.com and look under resources. You can actually read a Time article written in 1942 where Hum and Wadsworth are discussing the actual test and how, they tested something like 2 million people, which was a huge number at the time. Anyway, what happened was I learned the methodology, used it very successfully, and I ended up writing a book called Empathy Selling, which was how you use the Hum-Wadsworth in selling. But what happened was the literary agent, Jill Hickson, said to me, Chris, you can't use the names like paranoid and autistic. They're too pejorative. You have to come up with new names. So when you come across the new names that you're going to come across in a few moments, it was yours truly who invented them. So that's effectively how the model started. Right. Now let's talk about the 7 components. The first component we call the artist component, and stereotype. I'm talking here about a total stereotype person who has only this component, nothing else. And the reality in life is we have all 7 components, and it's the mix of them that develops our personality. But an artist is driven by the desire to create, and they're individualistic. They beat to a different drum to most of us, and they're the fashion creators, the architects, the people who have a tremendous visual sense and imagination. And where they are is their mental illness is autism, and they're above average on the autistic spectrum. The next component that we see is the engineer, right? These are driven by the desire to complete projects. And these people are very conscientious. That's their big thing. When they set a goal, set them to work on a task, they will finish it. And they are, in fact, suffering from obsessive compulsive disorder, and they're above average on the obsessive compulsive spectrum. The next thing are the movers. These people are driven by the desire to communicate, and they're extroverts. They love to talk and communicate to people. And where they are positioned on a mental illness is they're above average on the manic spectrum. By contrast, you then have double checkers. These people are driven by the desire for security. They have a lot of fear. But on the other hand, they're very agreeable. You've all heard the saying, misery loves company. Well, they're very nice. People find them very, very easy to get along with. And where they are is they're above average on the depressive spectrum. Then we have normals. Normals are driven by the desire for order. Someone who has a very high normal, very high on the spectrum, a normal component, is non-neurotic and unemotional. And they're actually a reverse. They're below average on the neurotic spectrum. People who are neurotic, in fact, can't control their emotions. So people who can control their emotions are not neurotic. So they're below average on the neurotic spectrum. Now, there's some interesting things about the normal. First of all, it's soluble. It dissolves in alcohol. And we all know that when people get drunk, basically their hidden characters come out. The Romans had a great saying, in vino veritas, in wine there is drink. The other thing about the normal, compared to the other six components, it actually increases with age. You become less neurotic as you get older. Well, most of us do. Okay, so you do sometimes have people relapsing into a second childhood, but that's not the thing. Then the last two components, we've covered 5 now, are the politicians. These are driven by the desire to win. These are type A personalities. They're very competitive, very assertive, very good with words. Typically, okay. And where they are, they're above average on the paranoid spectrum. Paranoia is their mental illness, and they're above average on that. And then finally, we have the hustlers. The hustlers are driven by material success, and they basically are driven by self-interest. They listen to one radio station, WIIFM, what's in it for me? And where they are is they're above average on the psychopathic spectrum. So you can see we have 7 mental illnesses, and we're in a different position on each position on the spectrum. And that effectively creates our temperament, our personality. Now, the Hum distribution of these components is shown here. And as you can see, the mover and the engineer are the 2 most common components, the desire to communicate and desire to complete projects, right? The lowest component is the hustler. And remember, the normal is the flip. So in fact, if you had people low normal, it'd be about 60%. These are people that are higher than average normal. And it's slightly skewed here because effectively this is done from an online test. As you can see, the sample size is some 65,000 people. And as you can see, computer testing, it's people coming up and taking it. Younger people tend to be more proficient than older people on computers. But you can see the spectrum there. And what's interesting about this component is the 5, what we'll talk about is the 5 most common components, with the first 5 I listed off, MD, AP, AE, and N, right? So remembering that it's, okay, and the 2 lowest are P and H, right? So if we go then on to the next frame, I'll now discuss the sort of other profiling systems that are around. The first one, which is very common, you'll see it all the time. You go to emotional intelligence websites and you'll see coach in emotional intelligence practitioner, trained practitioner in neuro-linguistic programming. Now, very simply, if you're not familiar with NLP, NLP says that you accept data, which you process either visually, audio, through your ears, or by touch. And this is called the VAK, basically, way of dealing with information. Now, there are some very good ideas in NLP. Trust me, I agree with. For example, Rapport says that what you should do is if you meet someone who's basically a high visual, you should use visual words, use drawings to make your point, and you should mimic the way they talk and act. And this is called developing rapport. And I actually totally agree with this. One of the key essence of social skills is recognizing what are the core emotional drives in people and tailoring your presentation and how you'll deal with them to basically make them feel more comfortable. Another concept, very simple, is anchoring. What we tend to do is we get an anchoring point. The classic example is buying shares. You buy a share and you never won't sell it if it falls below that price. Now it can fall below that price for a very good reason. And they say that for example, the sign of a good investor is someone who can take a loss. I.e., if you buy a share and it falls 10%, don't hang around, sell. Very, very hard to do because we anchor it on the price we bought. Now, NLP has basically some big issues. I don't like it. First of all, I find it to be a pseudoscience. It's full of a lot of scientific sounding terms which mean nothing. It lacks research backing. The Department of Defense in the States spends millions, something like $20 million, and came to the conclusion it actually doesn't work. And there have been experiments done which have disproved the sort of tenets of NLP. But still, of course, has a wide range of appeal. What I find amazing, it was a system to improve communication between people. But the two founders, Bander and Grindler, I think their names are, I've been in a lawsuit now for years. So they can't communicate to one another. I just find it ironical. The next most common system is DISC. Has a lot of derivatives. DISC is there's probably something like 2 to 3 million DISC tests done a year. It's very simple. It puts people into one of 4 boxes. Again, we see the 2-by-2 matrix, beloved by MBA students. And you can see up here, there's the 4: dominance, influence, steadiness and compliance. And you can see on it effective traits and ineffective traits. So people who are in the I box are people orientated, but they tend to talk too much, or people in the compliance book are accurate and detail oriented, but tend to be perfectionists and critical. So it's a model, and it's not bad as far as it goes. What is amazing is how many people have taken DISC and then to become somewhat creative, have changed it into sort of a different sort of 2-by-2 box. So we have team, which is togetherness, enterpriser, analyzer, motivator, animals, the analytical owl, the methodical hedgehog, the visionary fox, and the connected meerkat. Then people does colors: active orange, sensible gold, persistent green, calm blue. So there's an amazing range of DISC derivatives. Why I don't like DISC? Well, first of all, it's too simplistic. All the psychologists, they hate it because they say it's just too simplistic, because it really measures people on 2 scales. One scale is how assertive you are, and the second scale is how effective you are. I mean, affective in the sense of how do you react emotionally. To sort of increase the range, people say, well, there's DISC social and DISC work and etc. But I disagree with this. I don't think temperament is situational. I think your genetic makeup basically is not relative. It's situational. It's basically genetic. People with clean desks have clean gym lockers, right? Another problem with the test, it's ipsative rather than normative. It's a self-reporting test. You place where you think you are, and you don't place yourself where you are relative in the top population. What is interesting is the original book from which DISC was developed was written in 1928 by a chap called Moulton, and I've actually read the book, and it's total psychobabble. I mean, he talks about, it was 1928, they discovered electrons, and they were discovering protons and neutrons. So anything ending in OM was fantastic. And Moulton spends half the book talking about psychons. The other problem with DISC is, where is the corporate psychopath? Where is the person who can destroy an organization? And this test doesn't pick it up. Then finally, I'll talk about the other very, very common test used to talk about people's personalities, Myers-Briggs. And it's based on the work of Jung. And what it really is a model about the decision-making. But according to Jung, you're either an introvert or an extrovert. When you take in data, you either sense it or you form patterns, i.e. are you sensing or intuitive? When you make a decision, are you logical or thinking, or do you use your intuition and feeling? And then of those two scales, the SI and the TF, what's more important in your personality, how you perceive things or how you make decisions, perceiving or judging? And what happened was you then taking those 4 vectors and the two basically sides to them, you can come up with 16 different components. So if you talk to someone with Myers-Briggs, they'll immediately say, well, I'm an INTJ, and he will say, I'm an ESFP. And, you talk about in terms of the letters. Now, don't get me wrong. It's as I said, a model of decision-making, not contortions. Why I don't like it? Well, first of all, I find what's very interesting is Jung himself said that effectively where you're positioned on the sensing intuitive axis and the thinking feeling vary over time. So it's not a useful model because we're trying to look at people's genetic predispositions. Here we are using a model where your positions on the vectors change. Secondly, to remember 16 types is just too difficult. The secret is you can't have more than 7 items. That's the limit of your short-term memory. It's also similar to astrology. It's hard to pick other people. You can't do it simple. Finally, and this is the criticism that the org psychologists all rate at, is that it lacks validity. It doesn't measure what it actually set to measure, and reliability, they're pretty low. Another reason I don't like it is you aren't an extrovert or an introvert. People are normally distributed. They fall in the middle. So 67% of the population are in one standard deviation. If you have a quality with extroversions at one end and introverts at the other end of the spectrum, 67% of the population fall in the middle, and they're called ambiverts, right? People are normally distributed. It isn't you're an either or. Well, sister. And finally, again, the question, where is the corporate psychopath? Now we come to the theory that, in fact, the organizational psychologists do like, and it's called the ocean model. And what happened was with personality testing is you had Hum-Wadsworth, and people sort of, to develop a PhD in personality, you had to discover a new personality trait. And what you ended up with at the time, the most valid personality test was known as the 16PF, standing for 16 personality factors. And it's good. It's a good test. It's more reliable and valid than Hum-Wadsworth because it's more granular. But the problem is, to become an expert in the 16PF, you had to basically do it as a master's degree after you graduated in psychology, and it was a 1-year course to become sort of attributed to it. What also happened in the mid-1990s, 2 gentlemen sort of, I think, based at the University of Hawaii said, look, 16PF is good, but in fact, 5 factors explain 80% of your temperament or your personality. And it's easy to remember by the term ocean. And they said, which is openness to creativity, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, the lack of self-control. Now, there are criticisms of the Big 5. First of all, people have said, where is the dark triad, which is the corporate psychopath? These are people who are Machiavellian, narcissistic, and psychopathic. And then where's the type A personality? The controlling, assertive type, i.e. the corporate bully. So that's the criticism of the Big 5, but it has become now basically accepted, I think, widely as the de facto personality test. Now, what you notice is with Hum is that the vectors, the 5 factors of the Big Hum, match up. Most common factors of the Hum match up with the 5 factor. Openness, creativity is the artist, conscientious is the engineer, extroversion is the mover, agreeableness is the double checker, and the neuroticism is, in fact, the low normal. And what also we have in the Hum, which are the other 2 factors, we have the corporate psychopath. This is a hustler with low self-control, and a corporate bully, which is a politician with low normal. Now, I've gone about corporate psychopaths a lot. And the reason I talk about them is, I'll give you a good example. But I think being able to recognize corporate psychopaths is absolutely critical. It's the test of a personality test. That's the thing they've got to be able to do. If they don't recognize corporate psychopaths, I don't think a personality profiling tool is worth the paper it's written on. Right. Now, I went to a very, very good seminar in Sydney, all-day seminar run on corporate psychopaths by a gentleman called Dr. John Clark. And was his psychopathic checklist. This is what he said. He said, they're charming, but they frequently lie. They're very flexible. They do whatever it takes to close a deal. They take credit for other people's work. They guiltlessly blame co-workers and subordinates, never remorseful, self-focused, and act self-important. They listen to what's in it for me. They're good at manipulating people emotionally. That's very important. They do use people's emotions. They work out what makes them tick and they use them. They generally have multiple sexual encounters, and they never ask permission, but if caught out, will sincerely ask for forgiveness. It's a great list. And of course, if you're familiar with the Hum-Wadsworth, you look down that list and you say, we've just defined a hustler with low self-control. So anyway, why is it, I've said it's the test, why is it important? Well, I argue that Myers-Briggs converted an 85,000 employee company to 16 people in 1 year. Myers-Briggs destroyed a company known as Arthur Andersen. Now, Arthur Andersen's story is a wonderful story. This is him on the right. He was a lecturer in accounting at the University of Chicago, formed an accounting firm named after himself, which gives you an indication of his personality. Okay, and the famous incident, the incident that made Arthur Andersen's name was about 2 years in. His biggest client, a railway company, came to him and said, look, you've got to help us fake the audit. And what Arthur Andersen's reply is famous in the annals of American business. There isn't enough money in the city of Chicago to make me do that. So the client did what all good clients do when the auditor refuses to fake an audit. He fired him, right? And anyway, it crippled him, but he basically kept going. And he set up his motto was, you have to think straight and talk straight. And there were 4 cornerstones of Arthur Andersen science, as you can see here. They had profitability as one, but you had to sort of produce quality, good service, etc. So that was Arthur Andersen. And what happened with Arthur Andersen is that he was the first accounting firm to introduce consulting. And of course, if you have a consulting business and an auditing business, there's a natural conflict of interest. And in fact, his competitors all said he shouldn't do it. He has a conflict of interest. But what happened with Arthur Andersen, he set up a process to eliminate conflicts and also set up a management structure. What he did was, he said that in each geographic profit center of Arthur Andersen, there has to be one partner appointed who's the partner for probity. And his word goes, if there's a conflict, he decides what will happen and his decision stands. So that was the system, and Arthur Andersen became a very successful consulting business. Post-World War II, they embraced Myers-Briggs, and you had to go through the Myers-Briggs test at Arthur Andersen. Everyone knew their letters, but Myers-Briggs, and they became the #1 reference client for Myers-Briggs. All Myers-Briggs had to say when it was talking to someone else, they would be asked the classic question, who else is using it? They only had to say 2 words, Arthur Andersen, and the client would sign up, because Arthur Andersen's reputation in the American business world was impeccable. Okay. What happened was, of course, Arthur Andersen died. They went through several transitions of CEOs, and then in 1989, a gentleman called John Edwards became CEO. He'd done the Myers-Briggs, he was through it, okay. And what he did was, in 1989, they had the annual meeting of all the Arthur Andersen Profit Center managers. There was something like 2,000 in Dallas, and there was a famous conference called the Eye of the Tiger Conference. John Edwards walked on the stage with a live tiger on a leash to the music of Eye of the Tiger. And he then proceeded to give a speech along the lines of, it's a jungle out there. We all have to increase basically our fees and our revenues. Every partner in Arthur Andersen must double his fees within 3 years. Otherwise, he should no longer have a role in Arthur Andersen. And what happened was it came to pass. In 1992, there was the great partner purge. And of course, the one group of partners who disappeared out of Arthur Andersen were the partners for probity. They weren't basically rainmakers. They were there to make sure that the company stayed on the straight and narrow. And that was it. They all went. In 2001, you had Enron and WorldCom, two of the biggest business collapses in American history. Not only that, for example, in the case of Enron, it wasn't the Enron employees who were ripping up the documents and shredding them. It was the Arthur Andersen employees. Anyway, the institutional investors got hold of this. They turned around to each company in America that was an Arthur Andersen client and said, you have to have a new auditor within 12 months. And if you don't, otherwise, we will vote you off the board. Well, it doesn't take a board of directors very difficult when their minds are focused like this. They changed auditors. And what was amazing with Arthur Andersen, it was near a $10 billion business, 85,000 employees. It went to 16 employees in 1 year. Why? Because they couldn't recognize, pick up a corporate psychopath. They appointed one as their CEO. So, several caveats when we're talking about. What I do want to make this point again, you have all 7 core emotional drives in you. And just remember, 67% of individuals cluster around the average. I like to think of them as a web, and you have several strong and several weak strands. There's a good way of looking at it, but they all interact and touch each other. Finally, you can't change your personality, but you can change behavior. This is a very interesting graph. It comes from a book called Me, Myself, and Us, The Science of Personality and the Art of Well-Being by Brian Little. He's a professor of organizational behavior at Harvard. Book is a great book, probably the best book I read last year. And what it effectively does is he says in your behavior, there are 3 factors. Your biogenetic, which accounts for about 50%, and that's your temperament and your IQ. Your sociogenic, your family, your upbringing, your education, and your idiogenic, your situation, your health and interest. So to me, and that relates back to the King's Cut study, twice as nurtures, twice as important as nature. But you can change your behavior. You can learn things. And one of the great things is if you learn the Hum-Wadsworth, it is a fantastic tool for dealing with other people, particularly people who aren't like you and don't feel comfortable with you. So let's break up. Why I love the Hum. This is the summary. Last slide. All right. Why I love the Hum. Effectively, I think it's the secret of emotional intelligence is temperament. And I think it's the best model of temperament I know. It's easy to remember. We have all 7 components, and typically managers learn the technique in a day. Salesmen take about a day and a half. It actually encompasses other methodologies in it. DISC, for example, is the mover and the politician. Neurolinguistic program is the artist, the politician, and the engineer. Normal basically talks about Freud's superego, right? And he was the man who invented neuroticism. The way I look upon it is the Hum is an extension of the 5-factor model. That gives it its scientific validity, and it also deals with the 2 critical people in corporations, bullies and psychopaths. Well, I hope you enjoyed the talk. I'll relate back to what's happened here. Yeah, I've come back. Good. And I'll finish now. There's not much more to say. As I said, you go to my website, www.emotionalintelligencecourse.com, if you want to get more information. There's a couple of white papers you can download, one for managers and one for salespeople. I intend doing a webinar a month. The next one I'm going to actually do in January is going to be the double checker. This became as an afterthought when I thought it'd be useful for people to know what's going on, understand my philosophy. So if you do play it, thanks very much for listening, and look forward to sort of meeting you again in another webinar. The other thing you can do, once you go to my website, is sign up for the monthly newsletters. Right. Well, Happy New Year. May you all have a good 2016.